Is that warm? Didn't realize this was up here the whole time. Okay, I'm going to get started. Okay. Should I wait? Okay. Should I start or should I wait a little bit? Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about Jane Austen and her biography and her novels and the impact that she has today. So first of all, have any of you read any Jane Austen? Is anyone here read Jane Austen? Mm-hmm. Can you raise your hand if you read one book? At least one of her books? Or perhaps part? Has anyone read more than one of her books? And has anyone read all of her books? So what books have you read? Have most of you read Pride and Prejudice? Is that weird? That's like the most commonly read novel in America, so most people are familiar with that, and not everyone has heard of the rest of her novels, but generally Pride and Prejudice is like a household name, a household title, you might say, in America. So today I'm going to focus mostly on her novels, because those are what she's most well known for. So let's get started. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the time period, just so to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about as we go along and discuss the novels. So basically, Jane Austen she's an English novelist who wrote romantic fiction that was set among the landed gentry in 19th century England. So the landed gentry is basically a high-born social class, so it's not quite nobility, so they don't have titles. They don't have hereditary titles like Sir, but they're very wealthy and of a high social class. So they have land and quite a bit of money. So the landed gentry generally does not work. They would only generally work as perhaps part of the clergy or the military, but most of them didn't work at all. And they had enough money to just live on that and pass down to their sons. So the problem with this class was that was the way that money was entailed. That means the way money was inherited. So when a member of the gentry would die, his money would then pass to his eldest son. And if he didn't have a son at all, then it would pass to the closest male relative. So this is often a problem for women in this society because if there were no brothers, the mothers and the married sisters could be left homeless and impoverished because the money would be sent away to someone else who wasn't quite that related to them. So this is a subject that comes up again and again in a lot of Jane Austen's novels, the plight of women in gentry. So because of this, it was important that women tried to get married, because if they weren't married, they had no one to take care of them. So marriage brought them financial stability, and that was very important. So generally, women were married based on their social class. So they would all have a dowry that they could give, that they would bring to their marriage. And they would be said to be worth a certain number of pounds. So a woman worth 10,000 pounds would be quite well off and would be able to make quite a good marriage for herself. Some girls, unfortunately, didn't have this kind of money. So they had some more trouble finding suitable matches for themselves. So in order to kind of make themselves seem more attractive, they would cultivate their accomplishments instead. So when we talk about accomplished young women, we're referring to girls who are kind of cultured, who can speak many languages, who have read a lot and are intelligent, who have the ability to dance well and sing well and play on the forte piano, and things like that. So girls would generally try to develop their accomplishments to be more attractive. So girls generally married in their late teens or early 20s. If they were not able to get married by the time they were about in their mid-20s, they would become considered old maids. It would be very hard for them to be married after this point. So marriage was very important in this time period in order to have security economically. Okay, so let's talk about the life of Jane Austen for a bit. She was born in 1775, and her family was on the lower rung of the landed gentry. So her father had money, but not very much of it. So he worked in the clergy. He was a rector. So he worked to kind of organize the parish. She had 6 brothers and 1 sister whose name was Cassandra. And Cassandra was her confidant, so her very best friend. throughout her life. And neither of them ever married, so they lived together their entire lives. So Jane Austen she was educated, she had some formal schooling, but only for about 3 years because her family ultimately could not afford to keep her in school. So she continued her education at home under the supervision of her father and brothers, and educated herself further through her own reading. Her family, the Austen home, was described as having a very open and amused and easy intellectual atmosphere, according to Harcourt, one of the biographers. So they had no problem discussing the viewpoints of people they disagreed with, and just generally discussing intellectual topics. So it was a very good atmosphere for Jane to grow up in, so she grew to be a very intelligent young woman. Jane never married. She only received one proposal from a man named Harris Bigwither. It's a very silly name. But she actually accepted him initially because she knew it would be a practical match for her and help her have stability in the future, so she would have money and someone to support her. But she reconsidered it overnight, and the next morning decided to break off her engagement because she did not really love him, and he's actually kind of not a great person. So she decided to break that off and never got married. So in 1800, her father decided to retire. So he moved the family from their country home to Bath. Have you ever heard of Bath? Bath is a spa town in England. So basically, it was a fashionable place to live. So members of the gentry would travel to visit Bath for a period of time to socialize, and there were baths there. So it was for their health, but also for the social aspects of Bath. So there were lots of dances and opportunities to socialize and meet other young people. So young girls really liked the opportunity to go there. So she spent about 5 or 6 years in Bath until her father died in 1805. So this left her in a precarious position because Jane was unmarried, Cassandra was unmarried, and her mother no longer had a husband. So the money all went to the eldest brother. So they then had to find a place to live because they could no longer live with their father. So the precariousness of their position is reflected in the few years that followed, where they really didn't have a place to go. So they moved from place to place, they lived with different people, visited with their friends, and eventually were able to settle down with their brother Edward in Chawton. So in 1809, they moved there and spent the rest of her life in Chawton, and that is where she completed and published the four novels that she published during her lifetime. So she stayed there until early 1816, when her health began to decline. And then about a year later, she died, and no one knew why at the time, but biographers assumed that it was tuberculosis. She was buried in Winchester Cathedral. Alright, so in terms of her writing, Jane had a very supportive family, so they bought her all the materials she needed to write, the expensive paper for drawing, and everything she needed. Her father indulged her writing and was supportive of it, even though it's kind of unusual for a young girl to be writing in this time period. During her lifetime, as I said, she published 4 novels. She published them anonymously, so she just wrote on the manuscripts by a lady and didn't attach her name to it. Two of her novels were published after her death, posthumously, call it. During her lifetime, her novels sold reasonably well. They weren't hugely successful, but they were fairly well known, and she was able to make some money off of them, so that was fortunate for her. And she got a few reviews during her lifetime, but they were generally positive. And it wasn't until after her death that she became as famous as she is today. So after her death, there were about 12 years during which her works went out of print completely. But since 1833, they've been continuously printed. And then in 1940, critics kind of came back to Jane Austen, and since then she's been accepted as she's been accepted as one of the great English writers and part of the classic authors. So now she is quite famous, as you know. All right, so let's talk about her novels a little bit. So these are her 6 published, completed novels. Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion. So this isn't actually the order in which she wrote them. Northanger Abbey was actually the first novel that she worked on. She was able to sell the copyright to a publisher before 1800, and he actually did not publish the book and claimed that he never promised to publish it. I don't know if he was doing it, if he was just holding on to it, I guess. But it was a while before she was able to repurchase her manuscript, and then it was published after her death. But other than that, this is generally the order in which she wrote these novels. She has a few other works that are not as widely known. The first is Juvenilia, which is a collection of the works that she did as a young girl. So during her teenagehood and maybe early 20s, she wrote various short stories and compiled them later into 3 volumes called Juvenilia. She also wrote a short work of fiction called Lady Susan, a play called Sir Charles Grandison, a short essay called Plan of a Novel, and she has 2 unfinished novels called The Watsons and Its Ambition. She never got a chance to finish. But we're going to focus on the novels. So basically, they share a lot of aspects. They're all very similar in certain ways. They're all considered comedies because they all end in marriages. We also call this kind of a marriage plot, like when the point of the story is kind of to get married, and it results in a marriage. So all of our protagonists are female. They're all heroines. They're all 19th century English women who are from about middle class or upper middle class. They all at least mix with the landed gentry, even though they might not have been born as part of the landed gentry. Austen is known for having a very limited setting. She, as a woman, she mostly stayed within the realm of the household and never really got to go out and see any kinds of action, so she limits her writing to what she knew. And some people criticize this because it's such a small scope of setting. But she's also praised for writing about it so astutely. She really captures what that household life was like for a woman. So she's also praised for that. She's known for her social commentary, which is often rather biting. And she's also considered to be of the school of realism in her writing, which means that she doesn't present things romantically. She presents things truthfully as if they are real life. So during this time period, a lot of the major novels that were being published were more of a romantic, more of the school of thought of romance. So that means like feeling was exaggerated and things didn't necessarily happen as if they would in real life. So it was a bit more like a fairy tale sometimes. So she presents things much more realistically, even when they weren't pretty. So she's well known for that. She's also considered to have had a strong influence on the development of individual consciousness and inner life and character. So she was one of the first people to take an interest in the inner workings of her character's mind and present that to the reader. And then finally, she has very strong focus on morality in her works. And this probably results from her strong belief in Christianity. She was very religious and she went to church very frequently. So that never really appears in her writing. She doesn't really talk much about the church or about the Bible, but there are ways in which you can see its influence on her, such as her strong focus on morality. In terms of her style, she always writes in the third person, but she uses something called free indirect speech, which means that although she's narrating in the third person, she's presenting the thoughts of characters through her narration. So sometimes this creates an air of satire or irony because she's presenting things as facts, but through the eyes of the characters. So that can be entertaining sometimes. And she often uses free and direct speech to make social commentary. Her style is also very heavy on dialogue and low on description. So the characters are talking a lot, and she's not spending as much time describing the surroundings. As we discussed, realism is a big part of her style, and then as I was saying, there are impacts that the Bible had on her work. Isabel Grundy, one critic, says that the rapidity and fairness of her narrative and her brief declarative sentences reflects the influence that the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer had on her writing. So she doesn't make references to these works, but it's very clear that they have impacted her writing style. Alright, so now I'm going to discuss her 6 novels briefly, just outline them for you. I'm not going to give away what happens, because you should read them yourselves, but but this is just I just wanted to basically talk a little bit about the themes that are inherent in each of them. So the first published novel she has is Sense and Sensibility, which was published in 1811. So this is kind of a unique novel because it had two heroines instead of just one. So the heroines are sisters named Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, who are kind of foiled with each other. So that means they offset each other's characteristics because they're opposites. So some critics argue that they're binary, like they're completely different on totally different ends of the spectrum, whereas other critics argue that it's not quite so black and white, and that they do, Eleanor has some of Marianne's characteristics, and Marianne has a few of Eleanor's characteristics. But generally, Eleanor stands for that which is realistic and prudent, and Marianne stands for that which is romantic. So first we should talk a little bit about the words sense and sensibility, because their meaning has changed a little bit since 1811. So basically, today we would kind of use them as synonyms. Like when we say someone is sensible, we would mean that they're full of sense and that they think things through. But in this time period, it meant something a little bit different. So there was something called the cult of sensibility, that we'll talk about first. Basically, this meant that so a sensible person was someone who felt things very strongly, felt passions very strongly, felt anger and love and sadness very, very strongly, and they showed it. So they would cry and throw themselves down in their beds and weep and do everything they could to show that they're full of emotion. And in the mind of the 19th century person, this showed that they were kind of a higher moral status. Like they had more going on inside, they were more intelligent, thoughtful people or something. So people believed that was a good thing, to show that you were full of emotions. Jane Austen did not agree with this. She believed that there were two problems with this cult of sensibility. The first was that people can fake sensibility. So you can pretend to cry and therefore be considered a better person than you actually are. And so that was the first problem. And then, sorry, I'm blanking on the second problem. But basically, the cult of sensibility just believes that kind of person is a better sort of person. And Marianne Dashwood epitomizes that sensibility. So she's very romantic and dramatic. Eleanor, however, is just much more prudent and realistic and thinks things through and keeps her emotions inside of her. So a lot of the story is about how they react to things in different ways and the way those are juxtaposed. So basically, their father dies and they have no brothers, so their home and their wealth is passed on to a cousin of theirs. And they lose their titles pretty much, and they have to leave their house. So they have to go find a new home. They don't have very much money. So this is, as we talked about, this is the plight of women in the gentry whose father or husband dies. So they move to a new town, they get a cottage, and they begin to meet people there. So Marianne, the younger sister, who's very dramatic and romantic, begins to receive attentions from two people named Willoughby and Colonel Brandon. So Eleanor, at the same time, is holding on to this affection she feels for a man named Edward Ferrars, who she knew back at her old home. So both of the girls are disappointed in love, and they react in completely different ways, and this is pretty much the point of the story. So I won't tell you what happens, but the focus is on the parallel experiences of these girls and how they react to them. So these girls suffer from the extremes of their sense or sensibility, and basically they have to find a balance in between. So Pride and Prejudice, most of you have probably heard of, or some of you have read, it looks like. This focuses on the story of 5 sisters who have no brothers and an elderly father. So they're, so as we discussed, they have this plight as well of trying to get married before their father dies and leaves them poor. So the mother is frantically trying to find them husbands before the death of the father. So this story kind of focuses on all of their experiences, but the heroine is usually considered Elizabeth Bennet. So she's probably considered the most likable and admirable of Austen's heroines. She's witty, she's smart, she's funny, She's just generally a very likable person. So the story is mostly about her. Everything starts when a man named Mr. Bingley comes to town. So he's very rich, and he has an even richer friend named Mr. Darcy. So of course the whole town, other people in the town also have daughters they're trying to marry off. So everyone is very interested in these men. So basically some romances start up, and the ideas of Pride and Prejudice are very important in the story, obviously. And but generally it's the most popular and well-known in Austen's novels, although not really her deepest. It doesn't have like the deepest meaning in it. But it's a very entertaining novel. It's full of satire and a very interesting cast of characters who are very entertaining to read about. And another important theme in the novel is rebellion against the limitations of social status and gender. So this is something that we see the heroine Elizabeth rebelling against. She is of a reasonably high class, but we see her fighting back against people of an even higher class who want her to do certain things, and she doesn't see why social class should dictate that she should listen to them. And of course her gender. Great, and then the third novel that was published by Jane Austen is called Mansfield Park. This heroine is named Fanny Price, and she's a very humble and quiet and timid girl who really keeps to the sidelines. So this is unique because generally, a heroine is someone that you can focus on in Jane Austen's novels and who has a strong part in the proceedings of the novel, but Fanny is often on the sidelines, and she's really just serving as a perspective and a way to look into what's going on around her. So Fanny is born in kind of a certain level of poverty, but she has rich relations who live in a place called Mansfield Park, and she's sent to live there, to be raised there, because she has too many siblings and her parents can't take care of all of them. So basically she's raised among people who are of an entirely different class than her, so she really doesn't fit in, and she's not treated very well. People are not very kind to her, and the only friend she really finds is her cousin Edmund, who's somewhat older than her. So things are a little complicated when a new family moves to town. They're called the Crawfords. So they're very fashionable and attractive people, but they don't really stand on morally solid ground. So they're a little bit immoral and they have some problems and do some bad things. So basically, but because they're so attractive and interesting and fun to be around, a lot of people will start to fall in love with them, and it disrupts life a little bit at Mansfield Park. So basically, in the end of the story, we learn more about the value of love over practicality in marriage. So it's sometimes more important to actually love the person that you're going to be with instead of marrying for the purpose of economic benefits. And then also the value of morality over fashion. So the Crawfords appear to be very interesting and attractive people, but people like Fanny are a little bit more morally sturdy and better people. This is also kind of a coming-of-age novel. We see Fanny learning to assert herself and stand up for what she wants when other people try to manipulate her. So she grows from a very timid person to someone who can stand up for herself. And then, and this is also an interesting novel because it's our only glimpse of the lower-class squalor. Because usually Austen's novels occur entirely within the realm of the landed gentry and their estates and places like that. But this is the only time we see one of the heroines visit a lower-class home. This is where Fanny is from. Alright, this novel is called Emma. It's considered Austen's most well-crafted novel, although it's not necessarily the most loved. Part of that problem is the heroine, Emma Woodhouse, who Austen described as a heroine whom no one but myself will much like. So basically, she's very vain, she's very full of herself, she thinks she's really great. She's meddlesome, she tries to like fix other people's lives and arrange marriages, and she doesn't always know what she's doing. And she can sometimes be unkind and cruel to the people around her. So basically, she's the wealthiest young lady in her town, and it goes to her head a little bit. She's very proud of that. So the very first page of the novel describes her as handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and a happy disposition. So this is an interesting line because it kind of immediately shows that none of the normal problems that Jane Austen addresses in her novels is going to be the case here. Because normally her novels deal with women who don't have comfortable homes, right? They're women who are on the brink of poverty as they're waiting for their fathers to die. Emma, however, is secure in her wealth at home. So this is going to be a different kind of novel. So basically, the novel gets rolling when there are some new people introduced into Emma's life, some new people come to town, and she makes some attempts at matchmaking, which go pretty badly, and emphasize her failure to interpret behavior correctly. So this is a novel very much about a heroine growing up and learning to correct her errors. Emma has a lot of faults, and she makes a lot of mistakes, and that's pretty much the meat of the novel. Excuse me. So it's also considered a sort of detective story of sorts. So I won't tell you why, but it is considered one of the first detective stories. Not that they're like police and crime or anything, but it's a story in which you don't realize that you don't know something, but there's a detail that you're missing until towards the end. So it's an interesting story. And it's also unique in that it's a static novel. And by that I mean there's no traveling. So usually in all of Austen's other novels, the heroine at some point will travel to another town or another person's house for a visit. But all of this entire novel takes place in Highbury, which is the town Emma lives in. And this novel also has a very strong emphasis on community. More than any other heroine, we see Emma very involved in her community, which is important. Okay, and then finally, oh no, sorry, there are two more. Northanger Abbey, this is the first of two books that were published posthumously, so after Jane's death, even though this is actually the first book that she wrote. It follows the heroine, Catherine Morland, who is she's a pretty young girl. I think she's about 15 years old, and she comes from a very middle-class household. So she's not poor, but she's not rich, and she doesn't have a very large dowry. So she's very innocent, naive young girl. She's dreamy. She really likes reading novels. She's especially an avid reader of Gothic novels. Do you know what a Gothic novel is? What's a Gothic novel? So a Gothic novel is generally, it deals with like horror and like young girls facing like scary old men who might have romantic interest in them. So this is the kind of novel that young girls of this period really likes to read. So this whole novel is kind of a mockery of the Gothic novel. It's a parody of that kind of thing, because basically Catherine, she goes to Bath for the first time, she makes some new acquaintances, she meets the Tilneys, and is invited back to their home. So they live in an abbey. They live in Northanger Abbey, which is a big, old, dark stone abbey. And she has a very overactive imagination, and she starts imagining that this whole place is like a Gothic novel, and that there are dark, terrible things going on beneath the surface. So she's making up all these stories in her head, and it comes out badly. So basically the theme of the novel is focusing on the difference between reality and fantasy. And so it's an interesting novel. All right, and then finally the last one we have to discuss is Persuasion, which was the second novel that was published after Jane's death. This is a story about Anne Elliot, who's the oldest of Austen's heroines. She's 27 years old and unmarried. She's a very sensible and reserved young woman. And basically the story focuses around the fact that she'd been engaged 8 years previous to the beginning of the story to a naval officer named Wentworth. So she was in love with Wentworth, but then she was convinced to drop the engagement because her aunt believed that it wasn't a prudent match, because Wentworth was below her in status. Anne Elliot's family is actually part of the nobility. Her father is a knight. So to marry a naval officer was kind of below her station. So she's kind of regretted it ever since, and then 8 years later he comes into her society again, and the problem kind of resurfaces. So this kind of deals with the predicament of the old maid. Like for Anne Elliot, she's a pretty wealthy young lady, so it's not so much of a predicament for her. But but if you get to a certain age, you just really can't marry anymore. So that's unfortunate for girls who want to. And one of the major themes in this novel is the kind of juxtaposition of the snobbish and effete aristocracy and the genuine warmth of lower rungs of society. So we see a lot of times, and comes into contact with Wentworth's naval friends, like the other officers, and they seem to feel more sincerely than the people she's accustomed to be around, who are members of the aristocracy, and who are just kind of cruel people and very empty, and not as warm. So that's one of the major themes of the story. Alright, so all in all, there's some pretty major themes that crop up in a lot of these novels. The first is social place and the value of the individual with reference to society. So basically, often tends to question what the individual's place is, no matter what their social class is. So there was an idea that if you were below social class, your worth as an individual wasn't as high, and you couldn't question people who were higher than you. Often showed room for characters questioning people who were higher, and so this kind of establishes itself as a theme in her novels, that perhaps the value of the individual within society is higher than that. Another theme that's pretty common is the juxtaposition of romanticism and fantasy versus realism and reason. So that's something we saw when we talked about Sense and Sensibility, like the two sisters who, one was very prudent and one was very romantic. That also kind of shows itself in Northanger Abbey, when Catherine starts fantasizing about this abbey and thinks it's like a Gothic novel or something. Obviously, love and marriage are very important themes. The relationships within families, especially between parents and children, are quite important. That shows itself in lots of different novels, and it often shows a broad range of different kinds of relationships that children have with their parents, especially their fathers. And the moral growth of the heroine, so like coming-of-age novels, a lot of the heroines grow up throughout the course of the novel and learn things and become better people. And then finally, the freedom and constraint and the predicament that is faced by financially dependent women and who are relying on marriage for stability. So sometimes people argue that Austen's novels are feminist, and other people disagree. So there are kind of two schools of thought based on this. The conservative school of thought argues that Austen is not feminist because she allows her heroines to kind of succumb to marriage and reinforce the patriarchal system that they live in. So instead of, most of Austen's characters are very individual and creative and have their own goals and aims, but they sacrifice all of this to the duty of wifehood. So some critics believe that by allowing her characters to marry, she's reinforcing this patriarchal system. So another school of thought believes that Austen is more progressive. So they say that her protagonists are exhibiting individualism and rebellion against their roles as 19th century women, that they don't really conform to the exact ideal of what a 19th century woman should be, and that the reader is led to sympathize with these women who are left destitute through this patriarchal system. So when an author gets you to sympathize with the character, that can kind of change your perspective on the whole situation, right? And then finally, she frequently uses a very ironic tone in her discussion of this accepted social order, and this kind of indicates displeasure with it, because she's mocking it. Some other criticism that's been written about Jane Austen. Some people argue that there's a lack of deep emotional content in her work, that there's narrow subject matter, so like too much focus on women and their personal relationships and the trivialities of everyday life for the household wife, and when there are more important problems going on. There's the whole war with Napoleon going on in the background at this time period, but Jane Austen never mentions that. So anything that she touches on that is like of real importance, according to these critics, is just kind of on the sidelines and barely mentioned. So like skipping down to the bottom, for example, one critic named Said argued that there are post-colonial implications, especially in Mansfield Park. So Mansfield Park, the owner has some estates in Antigua, which is an island in the Caribbean. And it is these estates and the slave trade that's conducted there that allows him to uphold the beauty and gracefulness of Mansfield Park. There wouldn't be this peaceful, beautiful estate without the ugliness of slave trade in Antigua. So it's barely mentioned, but it comes up very briefly. So Said considers this the sort of nod of Jane Austen to this post-colonial world and the problems in it. And then finally, other criticism argues that Austen is kind of accepting the class structure as it is, and that the heir would, by marrying, support and maintain an inherited structure of values and values and behavior. This is Duckworth, who's another critic arguing. Okay, and then finally, pop culture. With Jane Austen, there have been a ton of adaptations. In recent years, maybe like the last 20 years, yeah, there have been a ton of adaptations. So film adaptations especially. So there are at least like 2 or 3 movies of each book, and there are TV shows that like serials that show the events of the novels. There are a lot of people who have written sequels to the novels. There are plays. There are all kinds of things. And then I wanted to talk a bit about the idea of the Jaynite, which is a phrase that originated, I think, sometime in the mid-1800s. It's funny because the meaning has kind of changed since the beginning. Originally, it stood for people who separated themselves from the public appeal of Jane Austen. So like a lot of people really like Jane Austen, but Jaynites wanted to set themselves apart as people who truly appreciated Jane Austen's worth and value. So they thought they were more, they understood her academic appeal better than the people who just enjoyed reading her books. But it's actually kind of flipped, and now after 1940, Jaynites started to mean, started to refer to the people who just kind of enjoy Jane Austen in a kind of ridiculous way, and like enjoy dressing up in costumes like as if they were in Jane Austen's time period, and things like that. So Claudia Johnson, one critic, explained it as self-conscious, idolatrous enthusiasm for Jane and every detail relative to her. So it's kind of like a ridiculous obsession with Jane Austen. So that's a well-known term about Jane Austen. So I think that's the end of my presentation. So I'm happy to answer any questions now if you have questions. Or anything that you want me to go over again if you didn't understand it.
Daniel, which of her novels did you like most?
I thought someone was going to ask that. I don't know, I was thinking about that. It's hard for me to choose. I think let me see, there are certain ones I'm not a very big fan of. Let's see, I didn't particularly like Northanger Abbey or Persuasion. I think it would be it'd probably be between Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. But it's so hard to choose, I don't know. They're all really good, and they all have very unique characteristics that make them each worth reading, I think.
What films did you see by these books?
Which film adaptations have I seen? I've actually seen all of them, or with maybe a couple of exceptions. I took a class about Jane Austen, which is very focused on adaptations. So we watched at least 2 movies for each of the books. So I've seen a lot of adaptations.
You know that there are 2 versions of Pride and Prejudice.
There's the Russian version of Pride and Prejudice? Is that what you call it?
With Keira Knightley.
Yeah.
And the other is
Colin, yeah,
older.
Yeah, the older one. I think that was like sometime in the late 1990s or something. And I think it was aired as a serial on TV. So I think it's like very long. I think it's like 6 hours long or something. At my school, when we watched that movie, we sat in the room all day watching this movie. It was a beautiful day out, but it's very long. Have you seen both of them?
Yes.
Would you prefer one of them? The more recent one with Keira Knightley? Yeah.
Were there in your class many students who were interested in Jane Austen?
Yeah, the class I took, it was only people interested in Jane Austen because it was a very small seminar. Well, yeah, it's a very hard class to get into because it's very popular. So there were a lot of people who tried to get in and could not. So everyone who got into the class really wanted to be there. So it was a very good class.
There were a lot of tennis occurred, or is it because
Yeah. Probably a little bit of both, but I think mostly because Jane Austen is very popular and very widely read in America, or at least very widely known. There's a lot of like anyone would recognize Jane Austen's name. Almost anyone would recognize Pride and Prejudice, but I think actually not a ton of people have read it. Like not a lot of people put in the time to read books sometimes. So it was a good opportunity to like read all of the books and discuss them and like learn about them. So before that, I had only read Pride and Prejudice, so it was a great class to take. Left. Oh, I totally forgot to talk about that. I'm sorry. You must be so confused. Okay, let me see. Sorry. Wow. I must have wondered why I put that up there. Okay, so this is one of the adaptations that's been made of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. So I've never read it, but it's I think it's a series of books where this author takes classics and he just adds "and zombies" to the title, and he puts like lots of zombie invasions in the story. Do you know what a zombie is? Everyone knows what a zombie is? So it's very, I don't know, it sounds very silly to me, but you can see that, Jane Austen is very popular because it qualifies as one of the stories that was chosen as part of these classics that were turned into zombie novels. So this picture is, the picture on the front, that's like the normal picture of one of the covers of one of the publishing houses that publishes this book. But they just made her into a zombie, I guess. No, I don't think she ever wrote an autobiography of herself, but there was a biography written of her by, I think, her nephew, so a very, very close relative who had known her. I think a few decades after her death, wrote a novel detailing her life. But I guess one critic has described information on Jane Austen's life as famously scarce. So a lot of her letters, she was a very big letter writer. She wrote, I think, over 3,000 letters during her lifetime, but most of them were destroyed. So there are only about like 100 left, I think. And so that's where most of the biographical details come from. And most of them are kind of, well, it's interesting, this biography that was written of her by her nephew is one of the main sources of what we know about her, right? But the thing is, it was a little bit biased because it's from the nephew's perspective. And to him, she was dear Aunt Jane, is what they often say. She was like a quiet woman who stayed at home and read and did her sewing. And so it doesn't necessarily tell us as much about her intellectual life. So it's not perhaps the best biography. But I'm sure there are plenty of biographies of her other than that.
are there any special clubs in your city for people who like Jane Austen?
At my college there wasn't a club for Jane Austen, but I'm sure there are Jane Austen clubs somewhere in America. For the people like Jane Knight, remember I was telling you about Jane Knight? I'm sure there are Jane Knight clubs. People who like make special Jane Austen cookies I've seen before, and dress up like the period characters and act out scenes from the stories.
Do you think she reflected her personality and her biography in some of her work?
I mean, it's hard to say because we just don't know very much about her and about what she was like. So, I mean, I guess you can kind of extrapolate what she was like through what she's written. So, I mean, I would say that she was a pretty spunky girl inside, just based on like some of the characters that she created. I like to think of her as being like Elizabeth Bennet, but maybe not quite so witty.